Well, I'm very glad to be here. Yeah. Um, Thank you. And I love the organization. It's a very cool group and a cool fascination that I share. And hopefully I will be able to shed some light on some things and entertain you a bit tonight. Um, I thought I would start with a quick reading of the book, um, from the book, rather. And I know that readings can be hard to pay attention to. This is only 7 pages, and I do have some photography accompaniment. And just a quick note about that is that before distracted driving was a big no-no, I used to take pictures while I drove, and I just liked how they turned out. I liked I'd be stop at a stop sign or maybe even still moving, and I would point the camera out the window, and some of them would be a little blurry, but in a way that I liked. So I'm going to read this. It's called The Overture. It's the very beginning of the book, and really it's the best overview of the story I could possibly give you. And I have some slides later that show maps and some of the people involved. But this really gives you the flavor of kind of why I wrote the book and why Interstate 69 has some significance. And the book came out in 2010, but what I have found is that a lot of these issues that I was trying to grapple with have become only more important and more present as the years have gone on. So we'll start here with a picture of Haynesville, Arkansas. You have to hand it to Haynesville. The town keeps its chin up. The busted little oil boom town in the northwest corner of Louisiana has been in decline for 30 years. Its population, which peaked at 20,000, is now around 2,500, and its one-time great wealth is all but gone. Most of Main Street is closed down and boarded up. Even the barber gave up and went back to driving a forklift. But Haynesville looks a little different from the desolate American small town you may be imagining. A few years ago, Keith Kilgore, an art teacher and pharmacist who operates one of the few surviving businesses in town, decided the place could use a little sprucing up. On the plywood veneer covering one row of Main Street buildings, Kilgore and a handful of his students painted a row of false storefronts. A charming little cafe with round French tables and chairs, a stylish ladies' boutique, offering dresses and shoes and hats for whatever make-believe special occasion might be happening around town, a cartoon flower shop, a pretend toy store. The renderings aren't intended to fool anyone. They're not lifelike enough for you to reach for a door handle or try to stand under one of the two-dimensional awnings in the rain. They're just a patch meant to show that the idea of a complete town survives, even if the fact of one doesn't. We know what's supposed to be here, they say, and we're saving its place for when it comes back. Kilgore's imagination is at work elsewhere in the town as well. When the old Planters Bank building burned down at the corner of Main and First Street several years ago, Kilgore got a few people together, cleaned up the lot, and fashioned it into a rudimentary park with a grassy porch, patch of yard bisected by a paved walkway leading to a white columned porch with American flags adorning the corners and rose trestles on either side. This too is a faux facade, a mask worn by the charred brick wall of the adjacent building. You can sit in a wooden rocking chair here, but you can't step inside for a glass of lemonade. From this prosthetic porch, there's an excellent view of the Welcome to Haynesville mural on the opposite alley wall, made visible by the collapse of the bank. Kilgore painted this montage with slogans and icons that represent points of local pride. Gateway to Northern Louisiana, it says, and Home of the Butterfly Festival, and Home of the Golden Tornado, the Haynesville High School football team. On the left, we see railroad tracks and two young men bass fishing. On the right, we see an oil pump jack, and between a truck hauling logs and an 8-point buck leaping past a pair of pheasants, a fat stripe of black paint with yellow dashes and an Interstate 69 shield that's moving so fast it has a motion blur tail. This mural, mind you, is a good 45 minutes drive from the nearest interstate, which is Interstate 20, not 69. But a town can dream. While the railroad tracks in this representation of Haynesville are a nod to the past, the highway totem is a tribute to the anticipated future. I-69 in this mural is like the figure of Jesus in a fresco of the Second Coming, the long-awaited Savior that shall come one day from above to reward all who believe. Above, in this case, is the north. I-69, as it now exists, starts up by the Canadian border in Port Huron, Michigan, makes a wide curve along the outer orbit of Detroit, through Flint and Lansing, and plunges south into Indiana through Fort Wayne, Muncie, and some of the wealthiest and fastest sprawling suburbs of Indianapolis. It then halts abruptly on the north side, where a flashing yellow sign reads "Freeway Ends." This relatively short piece of interstate is really no big deal. It's a stretch of dotted asphalt that gets a little wider and more congested near big towns, a little boring in between. Along it, people drive, listen to the radio, sit in traffic, talk on cell phones. Hotels and restaurants cluster at the interchanges. Trucks stop for gas. Factories close and move overseas. And in the outskirts of the larger urban areas, bunches of houses with green lawns sprout up from the fields. But I-69 is remarkable for where it doesn't yet go, but where it one day might. Another 1,400 miles south to Mexico, through Evansville, Indiana, Paducah, Kentucky, Memphis, Tennessee, Clarksdale, Mississippi, El Dorado, Arkansas, Shreveport, and yes, Haynesville, Louisiana, Houston, Texas, and on down to the border towns of Brownsville and Laredo. This corridor, in the vast gaps between the major cities that prop it up like tent poles, is made up of the kind of America that Americans think of least. It's not the familiar interstate America, nor the wild, beautiful America of adventure magazines. It's not even the quirky roadside America portrayed in kitschy travel shows. If you were to drive this unbeaten path, as best one can, on the state roads and US highways that I-69 is meant to replace, you would have the chance to appreciate the subtle variety of our nation's seemingly mundane body of grain elevators, water towers, and county courthouse squares. You would go for many hours without seeing a building taller than 2 stories. You would begin to suspect that some of the smaller towns in this country are nothing more than elaborate speed traps. You would pass tractors and combines, not just in the fields around you, but on the road in front of you. If your window was down, you would catch the aroma of turkey sheds and sawmills and coal-fired power plants and vast acres of wet crops. The roads you traveled would be uncontrolled access, as the engineers say, and at grade. There would be driveways and stoplights, and you would be at the mercy of whatever surrounded you. Over hills, the road would rise up and dip and twist. Where the landscape is flat and agricultural, the road would be barren and straight. And to towns of any size, you would have to slow down and succumb, if only for a quarter mile. When I drove this route, I decided that the old main drags looked best at dusk. The cracked paint on the aging buildings smooths out in the dim light. Power lines recede against a darkened sky, and the scrappy old signs look rich and warm. Bulbs, at least, don't rust. When the lights come on in modern, newly developed America, fast food places and retail strips can look cheap and alien, their vast parking lots lit up like airport runways. But along the smaller routes, the mix of chain stores and more mom and pops that remain look more human and handmade. They nestle right up against the roadway, glowing like a string of Christmas lights. Somewhere on the interstate, billboards blare and logos hover high like UFOs. Oops, excuse me. Gave you a sneak preview there. But when the off-interstate motorist starts to think about stopping for supper or sleep, the minor highway village slips into something more comfortable, puts on earrings, and hums a slow, sweet tune. Yes, living away from interstates has its privileges. It also has its pains. The same charming highways, which were the backbone of automobile transportation just 50 years ago, are now considered secondary routes, obsolete and inefficient. The interstates have guided a half century of industrial, residential, and commercial development in America, and very little of it has touched these towns, the populations of which, on the whole, are dwindling, while the average age of their citizens is rising. The rural I-69 corridor is an America where things are manufactured, but not as many things as once were. It's an America where great quantities of food are produced, but that task now employs far fewer people than it once did. Those who remain in small towns don't necessarily do so as an aesthetic choice. They might not describe it the way I do. They might feel ready for something bigger. Sometimes new infrastructure projects are mocked as bridges to nowhere or roads to nowhere. But a truth gets lost in that rhetoric. Once you build a bridge or a highway or a transit line, the nowhere at the other end becomes a somewhere. This is very often the point. It's the reason people want bridges. It's the reason people wanted canals and railroads. And it's the reason that for the better part of 2 decades, the Mid-Continent Highway Coalition, a group of politicians, businessmen, and community leaders from 7 states, has been lobbying to finish I-69. If built, Interstate 69 would be by far the most significant new highway construction since the original interstate system. The road, as supporters envision it, would connect the busiest trade crossings of the Canadian border with the busiest of Mexico. Their plan was hatched in the early, relatively innocent days of the North American Free Trade Union agreement, when the highest hopes about it seemed as plausible as the fears. The coalition, thinking grandly, dubbed it the NAFTA Highway and promised the forlorn regions in its path all the perks of international trade and economic development, trucks, tourists, and Toyota plants. Most of the communities along the proposed route are, like Haynesville, eager for its construction. They've waited for federal funding like farmers pray for rain. While there's no knowing what I-69 will bring, there's plenty of speculating. In Memphis and Houston, it is said it will support booming suburban growth, decrease congestion, and improve air quality. In the notoriously poverty-stricken Mississippi and Arkansas Delta, it's supposed to lure new industrial jobs and droves of tourists. In the piney woods of northwestern Louisiana and East Texas, it could bring baby boomer retirees looking for a pleasant place to settle down. On the Texas Gulf Coast, it's expected to provide more efficient connectivity to ports. Up and down the proposed corridor, eager towns have fought one another for inclusion. Local papers publish frequent editorials extolling its comings and goings, and breathlessly cover each small step toward construction. But it takes an awful lot of time and money to build a highway these days. Tonight, there will be licensed teenagers, well, now licensed 20-somethings, out driving, doing God knows what, who weren't even born when this last great highway was first imagined. More than $2.5 billion in federal and state money has been devoted to the project, much of it for pre-construction planning, but the full cost is estimated to be $27 billion, a figure that may rise as plans become reality. Federal laws and policies, such as the National Environmental Policy Act, have since the 1960s placed hurdles in the way of new highways. To win funding, states must enumerate the potential benefits, catalog consequences, and consider alternatives. The requisite intervening years have given people time to think. Local conversations about where to put the road have morphed into larger questions about whether it's worth the expense, whether it's needed or even wanted, and whether it might actually harm the middles of nowhere it's projected to pass through. In southern Indiana, organized opposition to I-69 is as old as the plans for building it. In the forested hills and small farms around the college town of Bloomington, stopping I-69 has become the cause celeb, and stuff of bumper stickers and yard signs, heated public meetings, pointed folk songs, and federal lawsuits. The road's proponents have tried to dismiss the growing chorus of rabble-rousers and knee-jerk environmentalists as selfish NIMBYs, but their grievances extend beyond the lines of property and cut across ideologies. Democrats and Republicans, young and old, hippies and hicks alike have come together to insist that the area's lack of interstate is more of a lucky break than a curse. We like things the way they are, they say, so take your progress someplace else. In the last decade, the I-69 project has also found itself tangled in a wider debate of how roads should be funded. For more than 50 years, gasoline taxes have paid for the major portions of highway construction, but the federal fuel tax has remained a flat 18.4 cents per gallon since 1993, and that's still true. And revenue can no longer keep up with the pace of maintenance and the hunger for new capacity. Many state governments have turned to privatization as a way to fill the gaps. Banks and toll road operators, many of them foreign-owned, have eagerly obliged, paying multi-billion-dollar upfront sums for the privilege of operating American roadways and tolling them for profit. In Indiana, a Spanish and Australian consortium paid $3.8 billion for a 75-year lease of the state's toll road, and Governor Mitch Daniels earmarked a portion of the proceeds for construction of Interstate 69. They went bankrupt, by the way, and had to return the road to the state. That's an update there. In Texas, I-69 became a component of the Trans-Texas Corridor idea, an ambitious vision for a new 4,000-mile web of privately financed tollways, railroads, and utility lines. The banking crisis and ensuing recession cooled this rush towards privatization, but only temporarily. Stimulus money wasn't enough to clear a backlog of maintenance work. The gas tax funded Federal Highway Trust Fund required congressional intervention to avoid insolvency in 2009, and there are reportedly billions of dollars still stockpiled in private funds, ready for investment. The pairing with these issues has turned I-69's NAFTA branding into a serious liability. Citizens have alleged that the road is part of a corporate and governmental scheme to bring Canada, Mexico, and the US together into a North American union, opening our borders and forfeiting our sovereignty while lining the pockets of global profiteers. Rural ranchers in Texas and young vegan anarchists in Indiana share these fears, if not much else. And with the arrival of these disparate demographics, the grassroots resistance to I-69 grew stronger and spread wider. Activists in Indiana occupied trees along the planned right-of-way and chained themselves to trucks at an asphalt yard. At rallies in Austin, farmers drove tractors down Congress Avenue with flags bearing the taunt of Texas independence. Come and take it. On ultra-conservative talk radio programs and liberal independent media websites, commentators have told their audiences that I-69 is not just a road, but an important symbol, even an instrument of geopolitical oppression. These strong feelings have occasionally spilled onto the national scene. The Republican Congressman Ron Paul made thwarting the NAFTA superhighway a keystone of his failed presidential bid. The long dormant John Birch Society found new purpose in these perceived threats to freedom and warned of the coming North American Union and its telltale roadways. And Lou Dobbs took regular umbrage at these highway plans, which he called a secret ploy by the super elite. It is absolutely a transformational moment, he said ominously and vaguely after one report on his CNN show. People of this country are going to have to decide what's going to happen with this nation. The people of this country made one big decision in 2008, and the election of Barack Obama took the transportation conversation in new directions. President Obama has championed high-speed rail and mass transit over new highways. The days where we're just building sprawl forever, those days are over, he told a Florida audience in 2009. With the interstate system now built and its effects clear, a growing alliance of transportation progressives is hungry to chart a new future largely by bringing back the neglected modes of transportation of the past. We have plenty of roads, these people argue, and unbuilt zombie highways like I-69 should be put out of their misery. They say it's time to reconsider the way we design our communities, to rethink how America moves. Not that these weighty issues seem very relevant to a hungry town like Haynesville, but over time, the magnitude of the project has made Interstate 69 a fault line for many of the key questions confronting America, not just matters of transportation policy, macroeconomics, and land use planning, but also the tug of war between urban and rural, and the blurry distinction between standard of living and quality of life. This is what struck me in piecing together this complex story, how the face of America is shaped in places struggling with preservation and progress, how the character of the country is decided a little more every time a factory closes, a farmer sells his fields, a town opens its first Walmart, a city allows its first casino, or a daughter moves to the big city. In all of this, our transportation system plays a significant role, helping to determine where we work and live, how well and with whom. Developers and speculators have always known the power of transportation, and people living happily or unhappily in quiet, forgotten places learn it quickly when the surveyors show up. So who makes these decisions on which so much depends? The future is hammered out every week in boardrooms, state capitals, public hearings, kitchens, and courtrooms, where business leaders, elected officials, and everyday citizens haggle over issues of eminent domain, urban planning, and development. Along an imaginary line down the center of the country, these struggles have a name: I-69. The highway has spread optimism and dread. It has inspired extravagant plans and incited rebellion. Advocates and opponents alike say they're fighting on behalf of future generations. Both sides warn that communities will suffer if the other side gets its way, and everyone accuses everyone else of living in the past. In its absence, this hypothetical highway has become a powerful presence. a conductor of grand hopes and fears. It will come one day to save or destroy the places in its path. It will bring jobs and culture. It will be the end of beauty and peace. It is a bridge to the future. It is a relic of the past. It will keep the young people from leaving. It will carry them away faster. It will save small towns. It will plow them under. I-69 is the best of highways. It is the worst of highways. It could be the last great interstate built in America, or it might never be finished at all. There we have that. That was the overture, I call it, for the book, and works as a very nice overview for the book. A note about how I became interested in this topic, as sprawling as it was very ambitious as a first book. But I grew up in Indianapolis, and in the 90s, when this became a really heated issue, I was in high school and college, and in the newspaper every day you read about Interstate 69, and these people were against it, and the lawsuit, and the where's it going to go, and the routes being decided, and it was a huge controversy. And then right after, saying my connection's unstable. You can still hear me, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So in 2000, I went down to Memphis and the Mississippi Delta to write a story for the Oxford American, and they were talking about Interstate 69 there. And they were talking about it in a completely different way. They were talking about it as though it was going to save them. It was the great development that was going to put them back on the map and bring them jobs and keep them from their towns from blowing away in the wind. And shortly thereafter, my father moved to Houston. And when I went there, I also heard about Interstate 69. But in Texas, they were talking about it as though obviously they were going to build it. Texas was booming. They needed more roads. It wasn't even a question. It wasn't going to produce any economic activity. It was really there to, they were late in building it to allow the economic activity that was already happening. So these three different attitudes in three different regions of what we now call Red America, which was just a term just sort of dawning in 2008 and 9, really captivated me. And I thought it's so interesting that this one project is allowing all of these communities to kind of discuss the cultural landscape and the built environment and feeling like part of the country or not, and all the changes that are happening to the economy. So I started traveling on my vacations from work and going to places like Lagodi, Indiana, and Evansville. And so I don't know if anyone knows Indiana, but the highway is supposed to go down to Bloomington, where IU is, and then through these small towns in the south, through Washington, Indiana, which I'll get to in a moment. And the opponents really were saying, you don't have to build this new terrain interstate. You don't have to cut up all these farms. You only save 7 minutes. You could go across Interstate 70 and down US 41, and it would only be 7 minutes longer. Why don't you? It's a lot cheaper. The towns there all want it. There's a Toyota plant here in Princeton, and a lot of communities here did not want it. They had moved to where they were because they liked being in a small town, but Terre Haute was dying for, and Vincennes and all these places. But it had to go through Washington, and I'll talk about that in a minute. South of Indiana, it's going to cross a new bridge across the Ohio River, and that's been talked about for many years. It's going to be a toll road, and I really thought Mike Pence from Indiana and Mitch McConnell from Kentucky would get it done the last 4 years, but they didn't get much infrastructure done. And then it follows the Kentucky parkways, which are some of the, pre-interstate parkways that were built at the state level before the federal interstate program kind of took off. And the exits and things like that are not to interstate quality, but they're in the process now of upgrading them. And with nudges from Mitch McConnell, they have been able to put up signage saying that it's the future Interstate 69. That is apparently a big deal in economic development. If you can say you're near an interstate, that's a lot more important than being able to say you're near some other controlled access 4-lane highway. In Tennessee, it comes through Dyersburg, where there's a big Caterpillar plant, and right along western Tennessee, and a new loop around Memphis into the Mississippi Delta through Clarksdale, Mississippi, home of the blues, Cleveland, Mississippi, and then it will go across a new bridge to Arkansas City, Arkansas, through the small towns of Monticello, Magnolia, and El Dorado. And then here's Haynesville, Louisiana, right up north of Shreveport, Haynesville and Homer. The road comes past the port of Shreveport and enters Texas right by Lufkin. There would be a spur up to Texarkana was the plan. Texas, so many communities wanted it. It was far from controversial at first that they ended up having to split it up, and they planned a spur up to Texarkana. They planned after Corpus, down near Corpus Christi, it's supposed to split into 3 because Laredo, McAllen, and Brownsville were all fighting over it. And so they said, you know what, we'll just build 3 interstates. So this is going to be I-69 east, west, and central, or something like that. So this is David Graham. David Graham in the middle with the yellow shirt, and his son and grandson and daughters, lives in Washington, Indiana. And he is why the highway has to go through Washington, Indiana. He's also why there's going to be an Interstate 69. He, for years, has been a champion of Evansville, Indiana, because his father and his uncles were the Graham brothers who made trucks in Evansville, Indiana. They were eventually sold by the Dodge brothers, but they made Graham Page passenger vehicles, trucks. They made the first Pope Mobile, and they were made in Evansville, Indiana. David Graham's father, Robert C. Graham, is on the right here, and he was also a real estate developer in Florida. He developed Ball Harbor. I don't know if anyone knows Ball Harbor, but it's a very Tony community with a famous luxury mall north of Miami Beach. And Robert C. Graham, David's father, was a developer in Florida and into road building, in part because he was a follower, an acolyte, not really an acquaintance, but not a friend of Carl Fisher. And Carl Fisher may be familiar to you guys as the main proponent of the Dixie Highway and the Lincoln Highway. But before that, he was the founder of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He sold headlights. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, and you all know a ton about Carl Fisher. I don't know, but he's a pretty amazing figure. But he developed Miami Beach, Florida. And the way he did this was there was a man named Collins who owned a lot of land over on what is now Miami Beach, but which was separated by the waterway there from the main town of Miami. And he'd been trying to build a bridge forever and could not afford to complete it. And so Carl Fisher went to him and said, I will pay to build the bridge if you give me some of the land on the other side. And that was the bargain struck. And the bridge was finished, which of course created the entire value of the land over there. And Carl Fisher set about building grand hotels and houses in what is now Miami Beach. So, and then this here down on the left, Carl Fisher was sort of famously he's quite a showman, and he knew how to kind of get everyone's attention and get press attention. And so he had a lot of elephants who were down there employed for their physical strength, clearing the mangrove swamps and everything on the other side of the Collins Bridge. And he had a baby elephant named Rosie that he was a caddy for the golf course. And Rosie the elephant was at the several childhood birthday parties of David Graham, because he would spend his summers down there with his father. So, it's no mystery how David Graham might think that you could look at a map and say, I think there ought to be a road there. And that is what happened. He was living in Washington, Indiana, and he, for years, had been involved in the Evansville Chamber's efforts to get an interstate built from Indianapolis to Evansville. And they studied it over and over again, doing these cost benefit analyses and everything. And all of the studies said, this is not a good return on investment. You will not get enough economic activity from building a major interstate down to Evansville. And so he was at home. He was hosting a economist named David Reed back in 1990, who was working for the Hudson Institute, then run by Mitch Daniels, later governor of Indiana. And the economist David Reed was talking to him about Interstate 69 and how they wanted to continue it down to Evansville. And David Graham said, the studies have just come back negative. They've come back saying it's not worth it to build. And David Reed looked at the map and he said, well, I know the way these studies work, and it all has to do with what you're connecting. So if Indianapolis and Evansville is not giving you the bang for the buck you need, what if you continued it to Memphis? And Memphis would be great, but actually if you could connect it to Houston, now the studies will really show a lot of economic activity if you connect Houston and Memphis and Indianapolis. And so they sat there and they drew on a map, and they drew where this new interstate might go. And this was 1990, when the federal interstate program was kind of technically ending with a bill called Ice-T in Washington. And so then one day, David Graham, who was retired, and his wife, Douglas, got in their car, or Stewart, I'm sorry, I knew she had a man's name, Stewart, they got in their car and they drove the would-be route that they had drawn with a Sharpie on a map. And they headed down and they met with folks in Memphis and in Paducah. And then in Shreveport, they met a man named John D. Carruthers, who was the former head of the Chamber of Commerce, an oil man down there, oil and gas man in Shreveport. And John D. Carruthers was the right guy to talk to, because he knew a Senator Johnston, and he took the map that they drew on, and he was on a plane with Senator Johnson going to some football game or something, I think, and showed it to him and said, let's get it done. And so now it was an idea that was in Washington. This was back in the day when senators and Congress people could make earmarks. So they started earmarking money for Interstate 69. Further south in Arkansas and Arkansas and Mississippi, men like J.Y. Trice, Ansel Cox, and this is a woman named Charlotte Schexnayder, who was, sadly, these three are all deceased. Not Bill Clinton, he's still around. But this is Charlotte Schexnayder, who framed the pen that Bill Clinton used to sign a bill creating a study for the Great River Bridge that would connect the Arkansas Delta to the Mississippi Delta. There was this funny problem where the people living, between Rosedale and Greenville on the Mississippi side lived about, 10 miles as the crow flies from the people on the Arkansas side, but it was a 2-hour drive. You would never know those people. You could see them across the river. If there were ferries that would cross once in a while, but nothing commercial and reliable in that area. And so this was a dream in Cleveland, Mississippi. A man named Charles Dean had this idea to build a bridge across the Mississippi. And so they were studying it. They got what's known as a record of decision, which means that the environmental studies are all done and approved. And the original dream was just for a 2-lane highway, just to shorten the drive, so you didn't have to go down to Greenville or up to Helena. And just then Interstate 69, the idea came through, and they started doing the regional studies, and they said, oh, there's a new crossing already planned we're going to make that part of I-69. So this is an artist rendering, and this is Little Arkansas City. And that's about it. That's the town right there. And this is taken up from the levee. And this sign talks about the Great Flood of 1927. I don't know if you guys have read Rising Tide. It's a really good book about the 1927 flood. But what happened near Arkansas City is that the river had gone past Arkansas City, and Mark Twain wrote about Arkansas City, and it was this big rollicking river town. This downtown was right on the river, and there was an opera house, and there was a prison that would be full of drunk people, and it was a lively place. And then in the flood of 1927, the levee broke, and all of that water created a new channel, and suddenly the river moved away from the town, and Arkansas City became landlocked, and it sort of withered and died because it was no longer, its reason for existence being on the river was no longer true. And so, of course, I learned this, and I started reflecting on Carl Fisher and sort of how these acts of God and these acts of man can be so definitive and determinative of where places get built in America, and how every little town on the map, even as you drive 61 now, you see towns pop up on your GPS that you can't actually visibly see because they don't amount to anything anymore except maybe a grain elevator. And so suddenly I started to see the map a little differently, and started interviewing mayors who just sort of innately understood what I was just learning. Here is Bill Revell. He's on the right holding the sign. Bill Revell never missed a chance to pose with an Interstate 69 sign, as you'll see later. I have a picture I took of him. Bill Revell's a fascinating guy. He's the mayor of Dyersburg, Tennessee, and he ran for mayor after he was at a Billy Graham thing at a big stadium, and he went to use the restroom, and he heard God speak to him and say that he wasn't done with him yet. He was a car dealer at the time, and that he decided to run for mayor in 1980, and he was mayor of Dyersburg, Tennessee for 26 years, from 1980 until 2006, when I met him, just as he had decided not to run again. Louis Bronaugh here in the tan shirt, mayor of Lufkin, Texas, a veteran, really fantastic guy, and the sweetest person you'd ever meet. You go around town with him and you don't get far, because everyone stops him to talk to him. Mike Allen was a Catholic priest who became an economic development guy and mayor of McAllen, Texas. All three of them are deceased as well. The opponents of I-69. This is Thomas and Sandra Tokarski, who live outside of Bloomington, Indiana. These are the woods behind their house that would, and has now, been divided up by Interstate 69. They've moved into town. They fought Interstate 69 for 20 years, or a little more. Thomas was an ophthalmologist. Sandra makes pottery and was a teacher, and they combed through environmental studies like, lawyers. Like they should have been employed by the people, and they would pick apart the studies, and it was their work that caused the state of Indiana to have to go back and redo a study. And they definitely slowed down the efforts, but ultimately were not able to stop them. In Texas, as I mentioned in my reading, it became part of Rick Perry's grand plan to build, to make the interstates look like the U.S. highways. So when the interstate system replaced the U.S. highway system, it was an order of magnitude bigger, and the Trans-Texas corridor was meant to be even bigger. Texas was booming, and they needed to think big, and they created this idea of having local, all the utilities and all the rail and everything in these privatized corridors. This was not a popular idea, and David and Linda Stahl, who live in the country sort of between Houston and Austin, got involved, got local politicians angry, got farmers angry, got city folk angry, and had this statewide organization. David Stahl would drive around the state he had a ham radio in his car. He had a laptop wired up like he was a cop, and went to every single public meeting and got people riled up, including a lot of pretty right-wing folks who they believed that this privatization of highway plans had to do with a geopolitical plan to take over the United States and create a North American Union and do away with the borders. And so there were some pretty angry marches down south. I think this one featured Alex Jones on a bullhorn yelling about how our roads would not belong to a Spanish king. But a lot of older people who I think were getting a lot of information from websites, this will sound familiar, I think might have just gotten the wrong idea. And this woman's sign always struck me: keep our freeways free. This being a huge misconception that we don't pay for roads when we do. And the idea that they're free is very complicated. So these are the sweet protests that there's Sandra Tokarski and Thomas Tokarski, and they would dress up as cows and trees and protest very sweetly in Bloomington, Indiana. But the young Earth First, more radical folks came around in 2008 and had the masked, torch-lit marches and would destroy property and do tree sits, and they took a bit of a more hard-edged approach. That really conflicted with the old school Thomas and Sandra Tokarski. And because of the sort of heat around all of these protests, when they just did break ground in Indiana on the new section of Interstate 69, they did it indoors. They did not want to go to the site of Interstate 69 because they thought I think there were people up in trees refusing to leave. So they got everyone together in the Evansville Convention Center. They laid out a blue tarp. They dumped a bunch of dirt from the site, and David Graham and Governor Mitch Daniels and some of the mayors, plunged their shovels into this pile of dirt on a tarp. It was very, very surreal. There's Bill Revell posing with a sign with David Graham. And this is James Newland, who was the executive director of the Midwest Highway Coalition. These three men are also all deceased. And here's Thomas and Sandra outside of the groundbreaking with their neighbors. These four are not deceased, but they have moved. All of their homes were affected by the construction. There's 12 minutes left, which is good. I feel like I went fast. I hope that was good. Maybe we can have some lively discussion if there are questions. I can obviously talk for a long time about Interstate 69. I feel like I just scratched the surface. I encourage you to buy the book. It's on Amazon. Love getting reviews of the book on Amazon too. And up on the screen is my website and my Instagram and Twitter if that's your thing. And if you reach out to me through the website, I'd be happy to sign a copy for you or anything like that. And I included one blank slide just so I would have 69 slides, but it's not there. So we'll stop at 68.
Well, there's one comment about, she's asking if it goes through Pike County, Indiana. And
it does. I'm so glad you asked.
There's a big highway being built, and then about 2 years ago, I think we found it finished and went on it. Why don't towns like it? These towns look far gone now. I don't think it would hurt.
Great question. So Pike County, one more. Petersburg is Pike County, I think. And why don't they like it? Well, Pike County does like it. Bloomington doesn't like it, and some of the farmers through here. And this is a very interesting question. So this whole notion of saving the small towns, either by building the interstate, which would hopefully create more economic activity and maybe give them a chance at a manufacturing site or a distribution site. And then on the other hand, people think, well, if you build an interstate, then the few people who do shop at the 3 shops that are still open downtown are now going to shop at whatever Walmart, whichever exit gets a Walmart. And so it's a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't dynamic, and people end up on either side of it. There's also specifically in Pike County, it's very coal oriented. And so they use rail mostly anyway. But a lot of the towns like Oakland City and Petersburg, north of Evansville, were saying, you're going to build this highway, and then you're going to build this exit, and we might get motels and stuff like that. But, we don't have the water infrastructure. We don't have the electrical infrastructure. We don't have the sewer infrastructure to sustain any growth. So this is kind of an unfunded mandate for us. If we're going to I don't know if you've heard, what a super site is, but there's places where it's basically a turnkey factory place. So you option a bunch of land, you put in the water infrastructure and rail and a road, and then you wait. And if you're a company, you're a parts manufacturer, and you want to put 50 jobs somewhere, you can just shop from this list of places where the land is already there. It's already ready to go. You just, put up and some towns even build speculative buildings, empty factories for people to come and occupy. But that's all very expensive, of course. So there's a lot of small towns kind of trying to edge up over one another by spending what little money they have on sort of speculative infrastructure. And it's some towns can't compete.
Well, there's some more comments. She says, great photos. My family grew up in Petersburg, Indiana, near Washington. Those small towns could use some economic help should this highway come their way. And then she said, was there opposition like this to building other highways such as I-75 and I-70, etc.? I remember I-68 took a long time to build.
So there was very, I've read a lot about the history of the interstate system. I think that the mood was very different at the time. It was the 50s. It was post World War II. People were falling in love with the automobile on a, that whole 50s thing of suburban growth and the good life that was offered to people after World War II. And the highways just seemed like a part of that. Famously, highways were very destructive to downtowns of big cities. And there's some research I found where, it was unclear to the people who thought of the highway concept. I could go on for another hour about this, but some of the early people, the planners who envisioned the highway, thought that there should be very few exits until you get out of the city. They thought it should be. They did not want to encourage sprawl, what came to be known as sprawl. So no opposition to, but I think criticism of the original interstate system is what led people to say, look, this is not going to help a town like Petersburg. They might get a gas station, but that would close 2 businesses in town. Is the fear. That's what opponents said.
Mm-hmm. Somebody asked, will 69 use an existing bridge in Memphis?
So it does not cross the river at Memphis. It comes around on land here, and so this line here, this dashed line, may end up being the route if the Delta doesn't get it together and they don't build. I-69 could be brought down here to 20 and come across 20 to Shreveport and then continue. This is called the Dickey split. There was a congressman named Jay Dickey who had some political power at a crucial moment in the 90s and exercised it. And so they wrote into the legislation describing the route that there was this optional route to Pine Bluff. So it's written there as an option. It's called the Dickey split, but then it kind of faded away as Dickey did.
Hmm.
But it does. Mm-hmm.
Someone asked, what is your view to complete or not complete I-69, or do I have to read the book to find out?
Well, I'd like you to read the book, but I'll spoil it by saying that the book takes no position, pro or con. And my feelings on it vary from who I'm talking to and where I am, frankly. I mean, and so therefore, what I found interesting was the sheer variety and strength of attitudes and the motivation people had for believing one thing or another. That's really what I found interesting, not the idea of making a case for or against it. It makes sense. It makes more sense in some places than others.
And somebody asked, how many miles of I-69 have been built and how many miles are unbuilt? Is the project at a standstill?
So in 1991, the legislation ICE-T basically put each state in charge of its interstate system. You were still paying federal gas tax. You were guaranteed 90% to 95%. It has changed over the years of that money back, but you had to pay for interstate upkeep and expansion. So Indiana has been built from Evansville north. They started down where it was popular and moved north to create a sort of inevitability so that they would have to finish it north of Bloomington. They're breaking ground on that last section up to Indianapolis, where they're going to have to take out a lot of homes. Kentucky has upgraded their parkways. There's a little section in northern Tennessee and a section south of Memphis. They one county, Tunica County, which has casinos in Mississippi, paid to have it built in DeSoto County to get those people from the wealthy suburbs and Memphis down to their casinos. But then it stops around Clarksdale. Arkansas has not built a thing. I think Shreveport is upgrading some roads in anticipation, but hasn't really built anything. And Houston and Texas is just going nuts. They were going to upgrade these roads anyway, so I think the shields are up actually down here in the Rio Grande Valley.
In your opinion, when faced with an interstate being built, is it worse for the local towns if the state road is repurposed for the interstate, or is it worse for these towns to be passed by a new route for the interstate?
Right. I mean, that's the big question. And I think when you say repurposed, do you mean upgraded, using the same right of way, I assume? I mean, if you have a downtown, there's no way you can use the existing road. You end up with that thing where it says, business route.
Yeah.
You even have that on the US highway system. And pretty much it's very clear that if you're moving through, then move around. And if you'd like to stop, then go ahead. But it actually in Petersburg, Indiana, before Interstate 69 was built, I think it was on 57 is the road there. The speed limit goes down to 20 miles an hour. And it's not a speed trap. I think it's that they want you to stop. They want you to stop and spend money at the store. And so they think if they slow you down to 20 miles an hour, you might be more inclined to stop. But that's an interesting question, an interesting dynamic.
Somebody said, can you elaborate on the 2D facades in towns? Why did they do that, and why?
Yeah, that was really about, I got poetic about it, but I really think the idea was, a board, just a plywood board, really communicates. It's sort of like this broken windows theory, right? Of nobody cares about this place. This place is dead. There's nothing here. This could be dangerous. It just communicates a lot of bad things. And there were some pictures. I can go out of presentation mode. A town like this, the plywood just looks very, very bad. It looks like you definitely don't want to stop there if it's closed or papered over. So I guess the idea was that if you paint it nice, and this guy was an art teacher getting students involved, paint it up so that,
It's like a
so
photo
that you,
op. photo
Yeah,
op.
you can tell that someone cares about this place. You can tell that these were once shops. Kind of, I don't know. You kind of trick yourself. It's like a rudimentary virtual reality, I guess. Like it's safe here. You know, we can't afford a cafe. Can't really make any money here, but if we paint one, maybe you'll feel slightly charmed. I don't know.
I-69 work in southern Indiana is messing up the historic Dixie Highway, creating detours and dead ends.
Hmm.
That's no question. I live near Evansville and find the drive north from here extremely boring. Nothing visual for me. Did the Koch family of Holiday World theme park in Santa Claus promote its construction?
No, I don't, not to my knowledge, but here's what's interesting is that now they're talking about a mid-state corridor coming down through Bedford and French Lick and Holiday World, which is right about here on 231, near 231 and 64. But oh, and is Koch or Cook? Cook's the guy who did French Lick. I don't know. I actually don't know if it's the same as what you're citing there. But there's right now a sort of I-69 Part 2 where they want to, now that this piece of interstate's built, they want to bring in Bedford and French Lick and some of these towns here, Jasper, with a new highway. So they're studying that, and you're getting the same kind of pro and con arguments.
Marianne usually takes 41 instead of 69.
A lot of folks in Indiana. I'm impressed.
The route has a lot of uninterstate-like ripples in Indiana. Is this due to towns getting awarded the route or true natural barriers?
Ah, very good question. And in fact, this sort of steep curve right south of Bloomington, that's where the Tokarskis lived. And a lot of people have suspected that they went out of their way to divide the Tokarskis' land, to ruin their woods. So that could have been true, vindictive, but they wanted to get Crane. I wonder if I can make this bigger for you as well as me. Does this work? There we go. So they wanted to get Crane, which is, there's a naval surface warfare center there. They wanted to bring in Washington. The family wanted Washington in there. So if you take Washington, Crane, Bloomington, and again, yeah, this bend here takes out the Tokarskis in Stanford. So it's all a good question. You can be sure that every little ripple in the road is either wetlands or an influential landowner.
Are there connecting highways in Mexico and Canada?
Yes. So at all those three crossings, go back to 100%. And I should have mentioned Robert C. Graham in another kind of wanting to be Carl Fisher. Robert C. Graham was on the committee for the Pan American Highway. I don't think he was important on it, but he participated in it. But there are connecting roads to the south. Previously, the Rio Grande Valley was not served by an interstate. No interstate came south of, I think, Corpus Christi. So that's one of the places where you look at it and you say, okay, yeah, that should be built. However, these were all 4-lane highways, 59, 281, and 77. So the people saying, you know, I-69 is going to create border problems. There were zero new border crossings involved in I-69 on the north or south. So the crossing with Canada was always there up in Port Huron and the Ambassador Bridge in Detroit, and the 3 crossings down with Mexico. There were no new crossings, and you could have gone from you know, Laredo, I guess, is the end of 35. You could have gone from Laredo to Canada easily on existing highways. It was always the NAFTA rationale was really they were just trying to put up a sail and take with the kind of NAFTA wind at their back, or what they perceived to be the NAFTA wind at their back. But it was really just a, you know, a lot of local interests getting together, exercising the political power they had. And, you know, in the 90s, you had the president from Arkansas, the vice president from Tennessee, the majority leader of the House, Tom DeLay from Texas, and the Senate majority leader, Trent Lott from Mississippi. They were all from I-69 states. So it was easy in the earmark era with those people going to bat for you to get Interstate 69 written on the books.
The photograph you showed with the painted murals on wood that the art students created, where is that located?
That's in Haynesville, Arkansas, which is north of Shreveport, near the border with, here we go. Well, north of Shreveport. Why can't I? There we go.
North of Louisiana in Arkansas.
Here it is. So it's just north of 20. There's Homer and Haynesville, these two towns. Right here, Shreveport. It's right by the Ark-La-Tex region, they call it. Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana.
And why did the northern part of 69 from Indy to Detroit get built so much earlier?
That was part of the original interstate system. That was intended to be built from the get-go. So if you look at early plans for the interstate highway system, there was always a road that kind of curved that way and ended in Indianapolis. Indianapolis, you know, the sort of slogan of which is the crossroads of America, and for a reason. You know, there's a lot of interstates that cross there. A lot of railroads did, and of course you have this pinch of the Great Lakes. If you're going from Boston to Seattle, you've got to come through Indiana because it's the, you know, Pennsylvania might be the keystone state, but Indiana's the state you have to go through if you duck below the Great Lakes.
Okay, well, I think that's all. Just